Welcome to the Six Hockey.
Garrett scores! Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Jared Rotenberg, and we are on the debut episode of a brand new type of podcast show that is now going to be a part of the Six Hockey Podcast Network. That would be none other than YapTime with myself, Jared Rotenberg. And as Simon knows, as the audience at home soon is going to need to know, is if there's one thing about me, it's that I like to yap. And what better thing is they're going to talk about with myself, Jared Rotenberg, and my co-host over here, Simon Hendrikse, than the Stanley Cup Playoffs. It's been, I'd say, one of the best Stanley Cup Playoffs we have seen in years. I've been loving what I've been seeing. And as of a few days ago, we are already in the Eastern and Western Conference Finals. Simon, what's your takeaway been on the playoffs so far?
You know what, Jared? I actually do agree with you, especially the first round. I thought that this is easily one of the best Stanley Cup playoffs we've ever witnessed through being diehard hockey fans, I think. Just so many great games, so many great storylines. And again, I think the four teams that are remaining, I think all of them have an equal shot, maybe except Carolina, at winning the Stanley Cup. So I think we're in for a thrilling Final Four and obviously Stanley Cup final.
Now, obviously, in terms of the hockey we've been watching, you're a hockey fan, I'm a hockey fan. We're all, if you're on the Six Hockey Podcast right now, it's because you're a hockey fan, for God's sakes. But as much as the hockey itself has been breathtaking, it's been brilliant, it's been amazing, we over here at the Six Hockey Podcast Network, our bread and butter is talking about the GTHL. And believe me if I tell you, there is a storyline here that it's more than just a mere correlation. There's an argument that there's an actual causation between the teams with the most GTHL talent, the teams getting the most GTHL goals, and the teams that are now going on deep Stanley Cup runs. So Simon, with that being said, let's jump into it. There has been a lot of hockey being played, series after series. There has been, of course, 8 full series in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs, 4 series in the second round of the playoffs. And would you believe me if I told you that the current metric of teams that had more GTHL scoring than their opponent, it's an 83.3% success rate, series winning rate, for the team that has the more GTHL scoring, ultimately winning their series?
You know what? I think when it's a high number like 83.3, that is something you can't really ignore. I think if that was maybe closer to 50 or something like that, you could say, well, it's just the year, it's just the players. But on a number that's, greater than 80%, I think you have to look at that as maybe not a fact, but more of like nope, this is actually a thing and it is worth talking about.
There's a very clear correlation. First, let's start in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. The Leafs versus the Ottawa Senators. Let's start in the Eastern Conference. It was a difference of 34 goals from the Toronto Maple Leafs in terms of GTHL players. The Leafs have 6 GTHL alumni on their team, and the difference in points between the Leafs and the Ottawa Senators, it was 34-0 in terms of GTHL points. That includes players like our very own Max Domi, Scott Lawton, a member of the Toronto Marlboros, Mitch Marner, of course, a member of the Don Mills Flyers, Nick Robertson, Toronto Red Wings, John Tavares, Toronto Marlboros, and Chris Tanev, another member of the Toronto Red Wings. Now moving on to the Ottawa Senators. They had 0 players on their playoff lineup, 0 players on their roster that were members of a GTHL team. 1 player in their organization, however, that would be, do you know the name Stefan Halliday?
I can't say I do.
That's a player in the AHL.
Okay.
But in his U16 GTHL season, he was pretty solid, actually. He had 39 GTHL points, and the only reason I know that is when I was researching for this podcast, because I also didn't know that guy existed.
Yep.
He currently has 0 total NHL points. This is a guy that has yet to make his NHL debut, and as such, the Ottawa Senators, a team with 0 GTHL points, they found themselves on the outside looking in fairly early in the playoffs, moving over to the Florida Panthers against the Tampa Bay Lightning. A little bit closer, the Tampa Bay Lightning do have some GTHL talent on their roster, but that was a difference of 16 points from the Florida Panthers and only 3 points on the Tampa Bay Lightning. Another example where the team with more GTHL points ended up winning their first round playoff series.
And now also taking a look at the Capitals and Canadiens series, where the Capitals really did dismantle the Canadiens in 5 games. What if I told you that there is yet another pretty strong correlation between those? 26 playoff points for players who played in the GTHL for the Capitals, and only 1 from the Canadiens. For the Capitals players, that would be players like Andrew Mangiapane, who played for the Junior Canadiens, Tyler Radish, who played for the Toronto Marlboros, Dylan Strome, who also played for the Marlboros, Tom Wilson, who could forget he played with the Toronto Junior Canadiens, some would say maybe one of the greatest Toronto Junior Canadiens to ever lace them up, Jacob Chychrun, who also played with the Junior Canadiens, and the only person to score a point from the Montreal Canadiens who played in the GTHL, that would be Jake Evans.
Jake Evans with the other 2 players on the Montreal Canadiens roster that are GTHL alumni, but put up goose eggs in the playoffs. That would be Michael Pezzetta, and as well, that would be Arber Xhekaj. Looking at Dylan Strome, I mean, a big part of the Washington Capitals offensive attack there, and he finished his Stanley Cup playoffs when the Capitals ultimately got eliminated in the second round, but he finished with a total of 11 points in the Stanley Cup playoffs. That was good enough for 12th best in league scoring in the Stanley Cup playoffs. Another example where the players that were really leading the charge are guys from the GTHL, major GTHL alumni, putting up big points. In total, in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs, the record for teams with the majority of GTHL points, the more amount of GTHL points, it was 8-0. There was an undefeated record there from teams from the GTHL. And that just isn't a coincidence. When you have a 100% winning percentage in the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs, when you had the majority of GTHL points, there's just no secret. And Simon, I want to ask you the question, why do you believe that is that players and teams that have the majority of GTHL talent were having such an easy time getting through the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs?
Well, I think there are a multitude of reasons. Now, one could be just the developmental is good or is better in the GTHL as it is for maybe the U.S. National Development Program or places in Europe, for example. But again, to me, it's more about the top end talent that we see come out of the GTHL. The guys like Connor McDavid, the Zach Hymans, the Mitch Marners, the Dylan Stromes, who, let's face it, was a beast in his junior career.
Their third overall pick.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it took him a long time to find that same level of success and production in the National Hockey League. But if you watch the Washington Capitals at all this season, you know that production came. It did come this season. It took him a while, but he was a major factor, playing a lot like how he played back in his GTHL days and beyond.
That's exactly right. And again, speaking of the Washington Capitals, Tom Wilson, another guy who has been a force in this league for so long, but really this year really became one of the better players on that Washington Capitals team. But then you also have players like Thomas Harley, who has really stepped up. You could make the argument that maybe besides Mikko Rantanen has been the most valuable positioned player for the Dallas Stars.
I scored a series-winning goal in overtime against the Winnipeg Jets to put them away. He's been a superstar, and that's a guy, he was a former 18th overall pick, and I'll remember that for the rest of my life, just because when that pick was being announced, they flipped his name. They called him Harley Thomas, not Thomas Harley, and that one was a little bit embarrassing.
Oh, that sucks.
But
Poor
regardless, definitely a player that I think heading into the playoffs, Dallas Stars fans knew him. Some diehard hockey fans like myself and Simon knew him. But I don't think he was a household name yet. And if you've been paying any attention to the Dallas Stars in these Stanley Cup playoffs, get to know the name Thomas Harley. He's absolutely sensational on the blue line there.
Yeah, Thomas Harley is a type of player where even going into this season, I had heard the name, hadn't really watched him play. I think the Four Nations, he stepped up big time with Cale Makar being injured. He had to come and replace him. He was just phenomenal in that Four Nations space.
And that's what I wanted to get into, the fact that I think that's the first time that his name kind of became general household knowledge. People got to know him, but he was definitely a surprise player. When people were making projections for what their Four Nations face-off rosters and lineups were going to be, I don't think anybody had Thomas Harley making their Team Canada lineup, and that was for good reason heading into the tournament. I think there definitely was an argument that guys like Evan Bouchard maybe got snubbed, and those guys could have gotten in over Thomas Harley. But I think when all was said and done, when Canada walked away with the win in that tournament, a guy like Thomas Harley proved that he had every right to be on that team, and he's carrying that same level of experience and poise, playing almost, he's a young player in this league, but he's playing almost a couple years older than he actually is just in terms of his maturity level. And that's showing that a guy that was developed in the GTHL is now being able to play an impact role on a team that very well, I mean, they're in the Final Four, and I'll get that out of the way right now. They're my personal favorite at this juncture to walk away with the Stanley Cup. I've been saying that since the start of the Stanley Cup playoffs. I'm not going to get into the team that I had them beating in the Stanley Cup Finals. That would be the boys hanging behind me, my good old-fashioned Toronto Maple Leafs. But regardless, I am still sticking with the Dallas Stars to win it all.
Yeah, I mean, hey, you like the Dallas Stars. I love the Edmonton Oilers. That is more of a heart pick for me. But I think it is worth noting the Edmonton Oilers have the most amount of GTHL points this playoffs than any other team. Obviously, that is led by Connor McDavid and Zach Hyman and Darnell Nurse.
Yep.
Right? They really have that top-end talent. But coming back to these specific players, I want to talk about maybe something that maybe gets overlooked. You have a lot of players in the GTHL that have very high top-end talent, like your Connor McDavids, like your Mitch Marners. But I think that's something that a lot of GTHL players have that not a lot of other, maybe, again, like the U.S. national development teams, not a lot of European players have this, are the players that come into the league in a bottom six role and continually to work their way up to becoming star players. People like Sam Bennett, Thomas Harley, Dylan Strome, Zach Hyman is probably one of the bigger examples. Even like Connor Brown, he might still be in that bottom six role, but let's not forget, it took him a while to get there. He was being scratched in the beginning of this season. He's fought his way to becoming a pretty damn good playoff performer for the Oilers.
And we're not going to spoil something that we're going to get into at the end, where we genuinely go through the entire top 10 in terms of GTHL scoring and the correlation that does have to the teams that are ultimately going far. But I'm going to drop a little bit of a spoiler alert. Connor Brown is in the top 10 of scoring in the entire Stanley Cup playoffs when looking just at GTHL talent. This is a guy that has stepped up, outranked some of his other GTHL competition, maybe guys that heading into the Stanley Cup playoffs you would have ranked and positioned above a guy like Connor Brown. But these players, as you mentioned, not only are they're the stars that the GTHL produces, your Wyatt Johnstons and your Connor McDavids, it's all these intangible players, these role players, your Scott Laughtons, your defensive-minded guys, your physical-minded guys. And on a team like the Edmonton Oilers, not only are the stars aligning in terms of the offensive players, it's their bottom six, an area that is, I myself have very much called out as being a flaw on this team. But their bottom six players, a lot of them coming from the GTHL, are a big part of the reason of why the Edmonton Oilers at this point are probably a heavy favorite, not by myself, but by the greater hockey world. They are the heavy favorite to walk away with the championship. We're quickly going to round out the first round of the playoffs and what happened in terms of GTHL scoring, move on to the second round, and then get into a forecast of what we believe is going to happen next. We mentioned it in the Eastern Conference with the Leafs, Panthers, Capitals, and Hurricanes. Each series there, the team with the more GTHL points ultimately ended up finding the win in those series. Moving on to the Western Conference, however, with the Jets and the Blues, it was razor tight, it was close, and that's pretty obvious because it's a series that went to Game 7 double overtime. But at the end of the day, the Winnipeg Jets are the team that had more GTHL points by a total of 6-4. And wouldn't you know it, with the fact that Cole Perfetti scored such a pivotal goal tying up that game, in the dying seconds of Game 7 regulation, he's a guy that is a GTHL alumni. So that's a GTHL player, an alumni of the Vaughan Kings is Cole Perfetti, scoring an important goal to even give the Winnipeg Jets a chance to win that series in overtime. And ultimately, that was the outcome and what ended up coming to fruition. Moving on to the other series, the Stars versus the Colorado Avalanche, a series that a lot of people heading into the playoffs said it was going to be the Avalanche winning in their sleep. Myself
included. I don't know if I said in their sleep. I believe I had the Avalanche in 7. Well, just because Robertson and Heiskanen were out, which meant that a lot of these players, such as Wyatt Johnson, Mason Marchment, Tyler Seguin, Thomas Harley that we've talked about, they really had to step up.
For sure. But the reason I personally was so high on this Dallas Stars team, I believe they're a more polished and perfect team in terms of the roster on paper. I believe the Colorado Avalanche do have some flaws in the roster, and I made a TikTok video on my own personal account calling them out for being the most overrated team in the entire Stanley Cup playoffs after the trade deadline. But more importantly, a reason that I also believe the Dallas Stars had a big chance to win, look at the difference in GTHL talent. The Dallas Stars are tied for having the most GTHL players on their lineup in the Stanley Cup playoffs with a total of 6. And the Colorado Avalanche, they only have 1, but it's not even a player. It's a goaltender. Scott Wedgwood is their only GTHL alumni on their roster. And it's no surprise that the difference in scoring from the GTHL players on the Dallas Stars versus the Colorado Avalanche, 34-0. It's a major difference in terms of depth, a major difference in terms of talent, and as such, I not only was confident enough to say the Dallas Stars would win that series in 7 over the Colorado Avalanche, but I also put, in essence, my guns on the line by not just having them win that series, but also having them win the Stanley Cup. And right now in the Final Four, I have to say I'm feeling pretty good about that prediction, and I'm a little bit regretting not putting some money behind that prediction, putting money where my mouth is. The Knights versus the Minnesota Wild, it was a difference of 10-0 in terms of the GTHL points. And then finally, with the Edmonton Oilers against the Los Angeles Kings, this is a series I'm going to be honest and call myself out right now. I was wrong on my prediction. I actually thought the LA Kings were going to win this series, but if only I had done this level of research before the Stanley Cup playoffs, it became quite clear that the Los Angeles Kings just didn't hold a candle to the amount of GTHL talent that the Edmonton Oilers had. The LA Kings had 3 players in their organization that are GTHL alumni, but only 2 of them actually made the playoff lineup, those being Warren Fogle and Brant Clark. They put up 5 GTHL points. Not bad. It's respectable when you have 2 players putting up 5 total points. The Edmonton Oilers have 42 points from GTHL talent alone on their Stanley Cup playoff run. Now, I will say, without Connor McDavid, it's 23.
But that's still pretty impressive.
It's still pretty impressive to have the remaining 5 players putting up that level of offense. Connor McDavid alone has 19 total points. He's a mutant. He's otherworldly. But in general, when you compare the GTHL talent, it just really is night and day that the Oilers have the top 6 advantage, but we knew that going in. It's the fact that their defensemen that typically have been called out for not being very defensively reliable, they are stepping up to the plate right now, and I've been very impressed with the Edmonton Oilers defensive core. Then, as I mentioned, the bottom 6, which typically is called out for being an area of flaw on this team, their bottom 6 is stepping up offensively and is contributing some goals. So with that said, it's no question that the teams with the more GTHL points were 8-0 in the first round. Let's look at the second round now.
Yeah, this is a little bit more of a toss-up per se. Now, this one does sting just a little bit, talking about the Leafs and the Panthers. Obviously,
one of 2 outliers.
Yeah, obviously a couple of big Leafs fans here. Again, as we mentioned, 34 GTHL points from the Leafs compared to the 16 from the Florida Panthers. Again, you had, Jared was just mentioning, you had players like Scott Laughton, Mitch Marner, Max Domi, Chris Tanev, John Tavares. John Tavares only had 2 points in that series, though, and it came in game 1, so let's not forget that. Again, the thing with the Leafs, it's such a curse, I find, because all the signs are there. There was literally a report that came from the government of Ontario yesterday, I think, maybe the day before, that said this was the coldest month of May we've had since 1967.
There are so many signs. Everything was coming together.
There are so many signs together. Yeah, but again, you look at this, and again, like, how, if you were to flip a coin 7 times, how many times can you say that would land on tails in a row? You know what I'm saying?
It should be more than 0-7, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think when it comes to the Leafs, again, as a Leafs fan, I hate to say this, if there is ever to be an outlier in a stat like this, it is 100% going to be the Toronto Maple Leafs.
So we'll get this out of the way right now. The 2 outliers in terms of the otherwise success that teams with the majority of GTHL talent have had in this playoffs. There's only 2 series where the team with less GTHL points have won. That being the Florida Panthers beating the Leafs in their second round playoff series, as well as the Carolina Hurricanes beating the Washington Capitals in their second round playoff series. So Simon, I want to ask the question, why is it, aside from just the Leafs leafing factor, why is it truthfully that you believe these 2 outliers came to fruition?
Oh, you know, Jared, that is a really good question. And there's part of me that wants to say I don't really know, but then there's also a part of me that says, well, let's maybe look at the organization around it, right? You have all the coaching staffs. I know Craig Berube and Paul Maurice. They're both Canadian boys. Again, Rob Brindamore. Like, you have all these players and these organizations that are coming behind them. Again, I think hockey is just one of those sports where you don't really have an answer for everything. Me and my roommate talk about this all the time, where if you play better than your opponent in basketball, 10 times out of 10 you're going to win.
Yep.
If you play better than your opponent in the NFL, 10 times out of 10 you're going to win. In hockey, that doesn't really work. It doesn't really work that way.
When you have a rubber puck that's floating around a surface of ice, there's going to be more bounces. There's going to be more luck involved. And I think we have seen that in the past with the percentage chances of having upsets, your second wildcard teams beating division winners and conference winners. It just is more likely at the end of the day.
Well, that's exactly my point, where it's like there are bound to be outliers in hockey no matter what stats you look at, right? Because how fast the game moves, how many players are actually playing, right? Again, when you look at the Capitals and Hurricanes, Capitals had 26 GTHL points in the playoffs compared to the Hurricanes 9 so far. That is a pretty decent discrepancy. But at the same time, the Hurricane, they have Brett Burns, who is a defenseman, albeit an offensive defenseman, but he is still a vital role in that lineup, who is not really, his job is not to score points.
Yep.
Whereas the Tom Wilsons and the Dylan Stromes, they are charged with leading their offense next to Alexander Ovechkin. So I think that also has to play a bit of a role.
So that's what I wanted to add in here. I think if you were to ask me the same question about why I believe these are the two outliers that ultimately came to fruition, starting with the Carolina Hurricanes against the Washington Capitals, I think it's just the overall system that these teams utilize. With the Washington Capitals, if they were going to go all the way and win a Stanley Cup, something that I very much didn't believe was going to happen, I've been banging the drum that they were frauds all season long. But besides the point here, they were a team that if they were going to go all the way, it was going to be led by their offense. They're a scoring team. They're an offensive-minded team. Whereas the Carolina Hurricanes are a team very much known for their defensive ability. I'd say out of the 4 teams remaining in the Stanley Cup playoffs, they're, without question, in my opinion, the toughest defensive team, the most defensive-minded shutdown team. And that comes from a guy like Rod Brindamore being behind the bench, but it even comes with guys like Jacob Slavin being on that D-core, arguably the best defensive defenseman in the NHL, a team known for their shutdown ability. So when you have a team that, they had way more GTHL points and more offense coming from that team, well, it's not like the Carolina Hurricanes won by offense, but just not GTHL offense. No, they won by being a team that was really good at smothering the Capitals' offense and shutting things down defensively. That, to me, is why they were able to be one of these outliers. And then with the Leafs against the Florida Panthers, it just simply is the Stanley Cup pedigree. The Leafs, I made the argument when we did our the 6 Hockey Leafs breakdown of what went wrong in this series. I said, and I do stand by this to this day, that the Leafs were the better team than the Florida Panthers. They had more offensive firepower. I'd even say on paper they were the better defensive team, and we were getting ridiculous numbers out of both of our goaltenders up until the very end of the series, when obviously Game 7 didn't go so well for Joseph Woll. But the reason the Florida Panthers won, the reason why they were an outlier, is it's not quite just the Leafs leafing, but it's a major difference in discrepancy between one is a championship-minded team with the heart of a lion, or rather the heart of a panther, and the other team is a team like the Toronto Maple Leafs that is known for folding under pressure. When they have the skill advantage, they fold under the pressure. It's a mentality issue, and that isn't something that having more talent or having more GTHL talent can fix. So I think it is pretty clear why there were 2 outliers in this case. I think it is pretty explainable why these are the 2 outliers. But then moving on out of the first round, it was an 8-0 streak, 100% winning percentage for the team with more GTHL talent. In the second round, it's a 50% winning percentage. So we'll look at the 2 series where the team with the majority of GTHL scoring and talent was able to find the win, starting with the Winnipeg Jets against the Dallas Stars, where the Dallas Stars won this series in 6, and we mentioned it was a Game 6 overtime winner by a GTHL boy, Thomas Harley.
Yeah, I mean, what a goal it was, what a series that was. Hats off to Winnipeg really quickly. If you're going to lose a series, holy hell, what a way to lose a series. They went down swinging. But again,
Connor Hellebuyck came to play, which wasn't something that you could have penciled in or predicted based on how he played in the first round. He woke up, though.
He really did. But again, I think that goes to the speaking about the GTHL. Again, you had players like Wyatt Johnston, who, again, I love the way he plays the game of hockey. I think he is almost like, I guess you could say, maybe an unsung hero.
He's so skilled. His shot is ridiculous. He almost has, underratedly, like that Bedard or Matthews style wrist shot where he launches it, and 2 seconds later it's in the back of your net. You didn't even know how it got there. He whips the puck like not many players in the NHL are capable of.
Oh, 100% I would put him up there. And again, we talked about Thomas Harley. I think another person you have to kind of consider, again, going back to the mentality that we were talking about with the Leafs, Tyler Seguin. Now, he did play in the GTHL, albeit a long time ago, with the Toronto Young Nationals.
You don't forget your youth, though. You carry that skill with you.
Well, that's just the thing. And he has been a consistent leader on this team. He's been the assistant captain for more than 10 years at this point. Ever since he's went
2011 won the cup with the Bruins, and shortly after that.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it was that year because he was partying too hard. So the rumors say. Don't fact check me on that one.
The whispers.
Yeah, exactly. But I think he is a player who has been with an organization for so long, and again, because he was there when he was pretty young, maybe he could have instilled some of the lessons he had learned playing in junior hockey and playing with the Toronto Young Nationals into the core of the Dallas Stars. Again, I don't know how much that plays an impact, but I do think that his leadership style, along with Jamie Benn being their captain, with the young players such as Wyatt Johnston and Jason Robertson, who played for the Don Mills Flyers, I think that does play a bit of an impact.
I don't think it's a coincidence that 6 impact players on the Dallas Stars came from the GTHL. These are very pivotal parts of the Dallas Stars lineup, which I would argue is one of the deepest lineups we've seen, not just this year, not just last year, but this entire era in the NHL, the entire cap era, I'd argue. How many times do you see teams this talented? With Wyatt Johnston's and Mason Marchman's, that's a guy that was a part of the Leafs organization once upon a time. Your Jason Robertsons, your Tyler Sagans, your Thomas Harleys, these are all players that are stepping up under the bright lights, and that does come to show that the GTHL's development is simply second to none. There's no league out there in the world that develops talent and prepares players for their future hockey careers quite like the GTHL does. It's a league of its own, and that's the reason that a lot of players that aren't even Toronto boys, aren't even Canadian boys, guys like the Hughes brothers, for example, an American family, they move over to Toronto in order to play in the GTHL just because the level of ability, the level of play, the fact that you get to play with certain talent and in certain tournaments that you just aren't offered that luxury anywhere else, it's a reason why the GTHL is second to none when it comes to player development and prepping players for the next chapter of their careers.
You know what, Jared? I wholeheartedly agree with you. And if we were just to take a look at the Oilers vs. Knights series, obviously we spoke about just how deep the Oilers were. But going back to the players on the Knights, let's just take a look here. They only had 2 players on their team who played in the GTHL, that being Riley Smith and Alex Pietrangelo. Now, again, Alex Pietrangelo maybe not being tasked with scoring the most points as he is maybe the best defenseman on that team, maybe second to Shea Theodore.
Yeah, well, one or the other. He's definitely he kind of is a mix. I'd say Shea Theodore is a more defensive-minded guy, but with Pietrangelo, the fact that he was injured for a lot of this season,
that's right.
I think he had to settle things back defensively. He wasn't really able to run play defensively on the offensive side of the ice, as maybe he's been able to in past years on those 2 Stanley Cup runs where he was the number 1 defenseman on 2 Stanley Cup winning teams.
Well, that's just the thing. And the other man being Riley Smith, who, again, is finding himself in the latter half of his career. Maybe his best days are behind him. No shade at the guy. Just, father time catches up to everybody. And again,
other than Jagger or Ovechkin, those seem to be outliers, at least for now.
Well, I hate to say it. I don't think Riley Smith is as good as Jagger or Ovechkin.
Really? Hot take?
Yeah, I was going to say hot take alert. But at the same time, again, Riley Smith, he's kind of a guy who has found himself middling between maybe your second and third lines. Again, it can maybe play on the power play, maybe second unit power play. So again, maybe not the guys who are tasked with scoring the most amount of points, but I think that goes back to what we might want to talk about in a little bit, is when you're building a team, what players are you looking for and what development have they had in their junior career?
Well, I think it's no secret that with a team like the Vegas Golden Knights, when they were on their Stanley Cup run in 2023, of course, winning the Stanley Cup, Riley Smith was a pretty important part of that. I know he didn't win the Conn Smythe Trophy. That would be Jonathan Marchessault. But he was an important offensive factor on a team that, frankly, smothered teams defensively and then was able to put the puck in the back of the net like it was nobody's business. Now, of course, after that season, due to some contract negotiations, if you remember, Riley Smith went over to the Pittsburgh Penguins, a team that was just simply nowhere near as good as the Vegas Golden Knights. They're a team in rebuilding mode. They're a team that's totally trying to overhaul their franchise and find their footing. And it's no secret that the Vegas Golden Knights, a team that had Stanley Cup aspirations this year, 2 years after winning it the last time, at the trade deadline when it became a question of who they were going to go after to try to get the Stanley Cup back in Vegas for the second time in 3 years, they went after who else but a GTHL alumni, a guy that had some insane development, was an important part of a Stanley Cup winning team, and they wanted him back to hopefully do it again. And as much as, they ended up getting bounced in 5 by just, frankly, at this point, a better Edmonton Oilers team, the fact that 2 players on the GTHL, one of them being an aging player, one of them being a defensive-minded defenseman that has been injured for a large part of the season, even the fact that they were able to put up 10 points just from 2 players, that is a feat in itself.
You know what? It really is. And again, we talk about the roles that these guys have. 10 points from a defensively minded defenseman and a mid-6 forward. I think that is a pretty damn good, feat for them.
Totally. And just looking at overall GTHL scoring by team, the Vegas Golden Knights, as we mentioned, a team that is a little bit older, a team that has been injured for a large part of the season. The fact that even in that situation, they still, just in terms of the GTHL scoring, just 2 players we're talking about here, the fact that they were able to come up and be 6th place overall out of 16 in terms of total GTHL points, I think that is pretty remarkable. And I think after we've wrapped up the second round and the first round, currently batting almost 100%. It's only 2 outliers of teams where the GTHL team with the most amount of points was able to win most of the time, only 2 times they haven't. I think now is the best time to go through from 1 to 16 a ranking of the GTHL scoring by team, because I think there are some pretty interesting stats that we could take away from this information, and using this information, we'll then go out and project what we believe is going to happen in the Final Four and beyond. Looking at the GTHL scoring by team, in first place, it's no question when you have a guy like Connor McDavid with 19 points in the playoffs so far, the Edmonton Oilers lead at a whopping 42 points out of GTHL talent. That's with the 6 GTHL players that they have. In second place, the Dallas Stars, a team that's also in the Final Four, they also have 6 players to their name, and they have a little bit less than the Edmonton Oilers, but they have 34 total points. If it wasn't for Connor McDavid, the Dallas Stars would have the most GTHL points out of any other team, but they sit second place to the Edmonton Oilers. Edmonton, Dallas. Unfortunately for myself and Simon and this guy right here, it's the Toronto Maple Leafs in third place out of points from GTHL players. That's what happens when you are the third team that has 6 total GTHL players. The Leafs also are tied with Dallas at 34 GTHL points from GTHL players. Then it's the Washington Capitals, another team that got bounced in the second round in 5. They had 26 total points from GTHL players, but as we mentioned, the reason that they ended up being bounced was nothing to do with a lack of offensive talent. It was the fact that they were smothered defensively by, frankly, a better defensive team.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And then going after Washington, you have the Florida Panthers with 16. Again, talking about the championship pedigree that was able to propel them over the Maple Leafs and even the Tampa Bay Lightning, for all that matter as well. And then you had the Vegas Golden Knights with 10 points, like we were just talking about, between Riley Smith and Alex Pietrangelo. Then the Carolina Hurricanes, who are also in the Final Four with 9.
And one thing I wanted to note about that is the fact that 3 of the top 5 teams in terms of GTHL scoring by team are in the Final Four. The Carolina Hurricanes are the one outlier there, but they aren't far behind. They are at 7th place in total. The Vegas Golden Knights obviously ended up jumping above them. But with the Edmonton Oilers and the Dallas Stars, the 2 teams in the Western Conference Finals, they're the top 2 teams in the overall league in GTHL points. overall. Then it's the Florida Panthers, a team in the Final Four, that are in 5th place, and the Carolina Hurricanes that are in 7th place. They're a team that has a more defensive-minded system. They're more of a defensive-minded team, and as such, I don't think it plagues them as much as maybe the other teams if their GTHL guys aren't scoring, because they're not going this far based on their amazing high-flying offense. They're going this far just because they are known for smothering teams defensively.
That's exactly right, Jared. And I think something that has really plagued and a lot of the discourse around Carolina is, they'll outshoot opponents by 10 a game. But a problem with Carolina, especially in the playoffs, we saw it last year. Last year against Carolina in the Eastern Conference Finals. 2 years ago.
2023 against Florida, yeah.
My apologies.
When they got swept.
Yeah, when they got swept. They had a really tough time putting the puck in the net, how you win hockey games. So, like you said, a defensive-minded team, not really entirely focused on outscoring your opponents in a 6-5 game, maybe like in Edmonton.
Yeah,
right.
They don't outscore their defensive problems. They are defensive minded first. Will score goals second to win the game, but they're more the team looking to win those 2-1 overtime nail biters. They're not looking to run up the score.
Exactly. And again, just going through the rest of the teams, the Winnipeg Jets had 6 total GTHL points, and they got bumped in the second round by the Dallas Stars. And then again, everything after that is first round exits. Again, with the LA Kings, they had 5 GTHL points, and everybody else, they have less than 5. That includes the St. Louis Blues, the Tampa Bay Lightning, the New Jersey Devils, Montreal Canadiens, Colorado Avalanche, who had 0, along with the Ottawa Senators and Minnesota Wild, who all had 0.
0 points and 0 GTHL players. It's no secret that if you don't come to the table with GTHL talent, typically you're not going to find much success in the playoffs. And based on those numbers, we're going to go through some interesting notes that, in my opinion, make it a case closed that there is more than just a mere correlation. There is, in fact, a causation between the teams that have GTHL talent and the teams that ultimately end up going far. So, Simon, for starters, the bottom 8 teams in GTHL points were all first-round exits. That is not a coincidence to me. That is a pretty damning injustice of teams that don't come to the table with GTHL scoring. They're probably not going to fare very well in the Stanley Cup playoffs. Now, the fact that 100% of the teams with 5 GTHL points or less were eliminated in the first round. Again, pretty damning when it comes to teams that did not assemble their team with much GTHL talent. More often than not, those are teams that are going home early.
Now, if I may, I just wanted to add one very quick thing exactly to that point. Jordan Kyrou, he played in the GTHL, and he obviously plays for the St. Louis Blues now. He only had 4 points in his first round series against the Winnipeg Jets, obviously going 7 games in an absolute bloodbath of a series. However, I think on top of that point of, teams with less than 5 GTHL points moved on to the second round, I think you need your GTHL players to step up in the playoffs like we see with Connor McDavid, like we see with Sam Bennett's and Tom Harley's, right? Like, you need these players who have kind of transcended into becoming like very core players.
You need players to take over. You need them to become gamers in the playoffs, and that's what the GTHL typically produces. And that's why the teams that didn't assemble their lineup with this in mind aren't really faring too well when it comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs. Moving on to some of these more interesting stats. Now, both of the teams with 0 GTHL players were bounced round 1, as we mentioned, but now looking more at the positive end of things, it's the fact that the top 8 teams in GTHL playoff scoring all advanced to the second round, at least, of the Stanley Cup playoffs, and then the fact that 3 of the top 5 teams in GTHL point scoring made it to the conference finals, those being the Edmonton Oilers at 1, the Dallas Stars at 2, and at 5, it's the Florida Panthers. Simon, what are our thoughts on that? The fact that there is such a clear, in my opinion, it's a clear causation, but what do you think? Do you think it's just a mere coincidence, or do you believe that there is something to this?
It is pretty interesting, all of those stats that we bring up. And I think in a game like hockey, kind of like I was saying before, there are a lot of coincidences, right? Because of how fast the game moves, because the way it's played, and the just amount of players that are on any given roster at a certain point. Like Scott Wedgwood, right? I mean, I guess he technically counts, even though I think he only had like 4 saves in this playoffs, right?
Yeah.
Or something
Well, he
like
only
that.
played about 18 minutes.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
he actually didn't let in a single goal in the entire Stanley Cup
Well,
playoffs. He had a
there you go.
0.00 goals against average and a 1.000 save percentage, but he only had 18 minutes and 30 seconds of ice time.
Okay, well, there you go. You know what, Scott Wedgwood? Good job, my friend.
Good for you.
Good job. But again, like I was saying, I think there might be some people who look at this and are like, you know what, that's just a coincidence. But I also think that the way that you build a team, obviously it has to do with your playoff success. And I think if you are the general manager of the Edmonton Oilers or the Dallas Stars, you are scouting in the GTHL to find your next big-time player. And I think these teams know that Canada and the GTHL have an incredible developmental system that really translate to impactful NHL players, not both on the ice, but also mentally, so that they can lead a team not into, but through the Stanley Cup playoffs.
It's not just something where it's like, yeah, sometimes teams with more GTHL talent end up going far. The fact that 100% of the teams that had less GTHL talent lost in the first round, that to me is not mere coincidence. The fact that it was 50% in the second round, but there are such clear and explainable reasons for that outliers, to me, it still feels like there's a pretty clear example and evidence there that you need GTHL talent and you just need guys that have been developed the right way to win, developed as champions to win in this league. And as such, 3 of the top 5 teams in the Final Four right now have that GTHL talent to their name. It's no surprise to me the level of play it's needed to win a Stanley Cup. And before we go into our projections for, based on this information, what's going to happen after, let's now go through the top 10 GTHL scorers of the 2025 Stanley Cup playoffs. We alluded to it earlier. We gave a little bit of a spoiler that Connor Brown slots in the 10th place spot, a player that's in the Final Four. There are 3 players out of this list that did not make the Final Four. 70% of this list are players on Final Four teams. So let's get into it. It's Connor Brown with the Edmonton Oilers, who currently has 7 points in the GTHL playoffs. That is good enough for 49th in league playoff scoring. Now, Simon, do you want to do a little alternating game?
Yeah, let's do it here. Now, the first player who was not in the Final Four, they got bounced in the second round, would be Tom Wilson, who also had 7 points, much like Connor Brown. A little bit more disappointing. That would put him at 46th. They're, I guess, tied with Connor Brown for 49th in NHL playoff scoring. But you kind of are expecting Tom Wilson to perform better than Connor Brown, in my opinion.
And that's why it's so impressive what the Edmonton Oilers are doing right now in terms of their depth. Guys are stepping up, which I've said as my notch against the Edmonton Oilers for years, is that I can't foresee their depth stepping up to the plate come playoff time. But the playoffs is a game of who steps up under the brightest lights. And as much as, maybe they don't have the most skillful bottom 6, but their guys are stepping up like warriors right now. And as such, it's the reason they're probably the large favorite to win the Stanley Cup. Moving on, we have a little bit of a streak of Dallas Stars. I'll say the first, Simon will say the second one. But in 8th place on this list of 10, it's Wyatt Johnston of the Dallas Stars. And honestly, the craziest thing is he currently has 8 total points. That's good enough for 40th in league playoff point scoring in the playoffs. But I'd say people are actually a little bit, not necessarily disappointed. That might be a big word for the Dallas Stars forward. But at the end of the day, the Dallas Stars are a team right now that it somewhat does seem that as much as they're known and highlighted for their depth, they're in the opposite mode to the Edmonton Oilers where, they're a top-heavy team, but they're getting depth scoring. The Dallas Stars are kind of the opposite where they are a deep team, but it seems like it's kind of the Mikko Rantanen party right now. Their depth isn't really contributing to the level that in the past we've come to expect, in the level that in the past we've known they're capable of. So I'd say for Wyatt Johnston, even the fact that he's in the top 10 in overall GTHL playoff points, it's definitely impressive. But I know that if the Dallas Stars, my pick to win the Stanley Cup, are ultimately going to do so, it's because guys like Wyatt Johnston and the next guy we're going to be talking about soon are going to step up in the conference finals. As for your guy, we saw him do last night.
Well, that's just the thing. Tyler Seguin, he has been a Dallas Star for as long as I can remember.
2 goals last night.
2 goals last night. What an insane comeback, by the way. 5 goals.
Crazy.
5 goals in the third period. Are you kidding me?
Crazy.
Get it together, Edmonton. Goodness me. Anyway, he was
the moment I start praising the Oilers, they just flip the narrative. They've made me look silly when I've doubted them, and now when I finally give them their flowers, they make me look foolish once again.
Well, that's just the way sports go, right? That's just the way it is. But yeah, Tyler Seguin tied with Wyatt Johnston. Now, again, you can look at that both ways, as maybe Wyatt Johnston's not performing at the level we want him to, or that Tyler Seguin is performing better than we expect him to, because I think at this point in his career, Tyler Seguin is expected to do less on the offensive front than a player like Wyatt Johnston. I think that's a pretty fair take.
Totally
I think that's a
fair
pretty fair
assessment,
take. But I think something that you have to think of when you think of Tyler Seguin is his leadership ability, like we were kind of talking about earlier. He's just been there for so long, and he's been a cornerstone of this franchise for like the past decade.
100%. He's been a very important part of that team that they've won a Stanley Cup in their history. In 1999 is their last cup. But I would say for the last few years now, they've been the epitome of consistency. They've always made the playoffs. They've always gone on deep runs, making 3 straight conference finals. They made the Stanley Cup Finals in 2020. And it does feel like this team has yet to break through and ultimately win a Stanley Cup. But if they're going to do so, it's because a guy like Tyler Seguin pulls rock and pulls blood from a stone and turns back the clock about a decade to his ability that he showed in the mid-2020s. If he could bring that, or rather the mid-2010s, if he could bring that into the mid-2020s, they have a pretty damn good shot of winning the Stanley Cup.
I totally agree. And kind of to your point that you were just talking about, it's kind of the Mikko Rantanen show. It's kind of the Rupe Hintz show. Even Mikael Granlund, he has been stepping up big
Finnish
time.
Mafia.
Yeah, the Finnish Mafia. I bet they're partying like it's 1999 in that locker room every single day. But again, Tyler Seguin, Wyatt Johnston, and a guy we will talk about in just a moment, very big contributors to this Dallas Stars core throughout these playoffs.
Now moving on to number 10, 9, 8, 7, 6th place. It's Zach Hyman of the Edmonton Oilers. 8th place overall in scoring, or rather 38th overall in scoring, with 8 total points, tied with Tyler Seguin and Wyatt Johnston. That's 8 points total, and that's a guy who, when he was on the Leafs, he was that top line left winger on this Leafs team, but he was kind of just the guy that went into the corners, did the dirty work. We called him the rabid dog who went into the corner to steal that puck and give the puck to Austin Matthews and Mitch Marner, and as such, he kind of put up his cookies, but he definitely wasn't an offensive difference maker or an offensive game changer. Now, on the Edmonton Oilers, they've utilized him in a little bit of a different role, and as such, not only is he getting the puck in the corners, because he's always, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You're not going to stop Zach Hyman from going into the corner to grab the puck. But what he is able to do is not just grab the puck and feed it to these other guys. He's also driving a line on his own. He's also contributing to offense. He's also putting the puck in the back of the net and is a very important guy for this team.
It's crazy what happens when you play with Connor McDavid. Yeah, no. I mean, I don't think I could have said it better myself. He used to play with the Leafs, and he was known for being that, nitty-gritty guy, but maybe not for his offensive prowess. Or with the Oilers, he's turned that around. He scored 50 goals last year in 2023-24.
He was
right?
unbelievable
just
last year.
Unbelievable. And,
and carried it over into the playoffs as well.
Exactly.
They were a game away from winning the Stanley Cup.
Exactly. And I don't know if I mentioned this, Edmonton is my pick to win the Cup. I just think it's Connor's year, and
they do look really good. I wouldn't be shocked.
And again, everyone says Connor's year, Leon's year, all of this stuff. They're going to need Zach Hyman to play like he played in last year's playoff if they want a chance at not only beating Dallas, but winning the Stanley Cup.
100%. Now we'll quickly gun through the remaining top 10 and then end this show off with our projections of what we believe is going to happen based on this information. Thomas Harley, we've talked at length about how important and impactful he's been on the Dallas Stars defensive core as a defenseman who a lot of people in the hockey world didn't necessarily know his name heading into this season or heading into this playoffs. 11 points, 20th total in league playoff point scoring, and of course scored that second round series winning goal in overtime to knock out the Winnipeg Jets. Dylan Strome and Mitch Marner are number 3 and number 2, both guys who were eliminated in the second round. Mitch Marner, a guy who's for now a Toronto Maple Leaf, but it's heavily thought that his time in Toronto has come to an end.
We talked about that in our other video, so please go check that out.
But 13 points in the playoffs, was 7th in league playoff point scoring, and of course was second place out of GTHL guys. Dylan Strome was a little bit behind at 11 total points, 12th in total league playoff point scoring.
We talk about outliers, and I think when you look at the names on this list, you have Connor Brown, Tom Wilson, Wyatt Johnson, Tyler Seguin, Zach Hyman, and everyone else we've talked about. Dylan Strome and Mitch Marner, I think, are guys who their team relies on them to really drive their offense and to get points for them, especially Dylan Strome out there on a line with Alexander Ovechkin. He is really the playmaker of that line, and he's
top line center as well.
Well, that's just the thing, right? And again, same thing for Mitch Marner, where he is like the playmaker of the top line, playing with Matthews and Nyes. So I guess they are outliers in the sense that they were bounced in the second round, but I think you also have to keep in mind that those are two guys that are the most important in terms of generating offense for their respective teams.
And now we'll get into the number one spot, the top guy out of GTHL scoring in the Stanley Cup playoffs. No surprise, it's Connor McDavid of the Edmonton Oilers, who has 19 total points in the Stanley Cup playoffs this year, good enough for third overall in league playoff point scoring. And if you do the math at home, that's a whopping 70% of the guys in the top 10 of GTHL point scorers are in the Final Four of the Stanley Cup playoffs. The guys from the GTHL that are coming to play and are bringing it into the playoffs are part of the teams that ultimately now have a 1 in 4 chance of walking away with the greatest prize of all, Lord Stanley's Cup. We'll quickly do a little bit of a forecast of the Eastern Conference Finals, the Western Conference Finals, and based on this, the Stanley Cup Finals. And then we'll wrap this show up and send her home. Looking at the Eastern Conference Finals, we mentioned it. It's a matchup between the Florida Panthers and the Carolina Hurricanes. The Florida Panthers currently leading this series 1-0 total. When you look at the GTHL points in a head-to-head matchup, the Florida Panthers do have the advantage in terms of 16 points. They have 16 points to Carolina's 9 points. Now, I did want to make a note about this, however, because as we talked about, when the Carolina Hurricanes beat the Washington Capitals in the second round playoff series, they were one of the two outliers that we've seen in the Stanley Cup playoffs. They're a team that has not won based on their high-flying offense. They've won based on their amazing defensive play. So I wouldn't say it's impossible for them to upset the Florida Panthers here. But if you're following the formula that teams that have the majority of GTHL talent tend to go far, it's looking pretty likely that the Florida Panthers, for good reason I would say, are the heavy favorite in this series. Now we're going to move over to the Western Conference Finals before we finish her up with the Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah, again, if you're going based on the formula, Edmonton has 42 GTHL points in the playoffs compared to Dallas with 34. Now, again, those are teams 1 and 2 in terms of GTHL.
They're neck and neck.
They're neck and neck. Now, here's an interesting thing for me. And again, if you were to go with the math, you would think that the Edmonton Oilers would win this series. That is what I am predicting personally.
And I'm not.
However, I think this goes back to an old debate of does top talent carry you through the playoffs, or does depth scoring carry you through the playoffs? And I think whatever way you look at it really does determine who you think is going to win the series, because obviously you look at Edmonton, they're led by Connor McDavid and Zach Hyman, right? Mostly Connor McDavid, though. So, who is capable of just taking over games and taking over series, whereas Dallas, like we said, the Wyatt Johnsons, the Tyler Seguins, they are depth scoring. And I guess, Jason Robertson, great player, but he did come back from an injury, so who knows how healthy and how effective
he hasn't really been contributing to the level we've known he's capable of in the past. Only 2 points so far in the 7 games that he's played.
Exactly. Thank you, Jared. I didn't know he only had 2 points. That's 2
assists as well. He's yet to score his first goal.
Yeah. So when you take a look at that, it really is kind of a mental battle of, well, do I trust a top star with his development and his history, or do I trust the 3 or 4 depth pieces and their development and their history? And personally, I think superstars win championships. I guess we're Leaf fans, so we don't really know how that feels like, but I am going to say the Edmonton Oilers.
The one thing I'm actually going to push back on that a little bit, I think that was the narrative that we saw in last year's Stanley Cup playoffs, where the reason I was so high on the Dallas Stars heading into that conference final series is that the Dallas Stars were getting way more depth scoring than the Edmonton Oilers were. The Edmonton Oilers, in my opinion, if they won it last year, it would have been in like the NBA style way, where one player is carrying you all the way. Connor McDavid was playing on another planet. He was a man on a mission. He was otherworldly.
Won a Conn Smythe without winning the cup.
Exactly. The Edmonton Oilers, though, last year were not getting depth scoring, and the Dallas Stars were. This year, however, as much as on paper the Dallas Stars are a way deeper and a deeper team than the Edmonton Oilers, they're way better built in my opinion. It's actually the Dallas Stars that are relying a lot more on their top six than the Edmonton Oilers are. The Edmonton Oilers have clearly learned from what went wrong in last year's Stanley Cup playoffs, even though they were just a game shy of the Stanley Cup. And they've stepped up in terms of their depth scoring majorly, whereas for the Dallas Stars currently heading into Game 6 against the Winnipeg Jets, Mikko Rantanen had over half of their total goals. Heading into that game, it was Mikko Rantanen having 9 of the total 19 points that the Dallas Stars had scored in their playoff run. So for the Dallas Stars, my ultimate Stanley Cup pick to win this series and win this game, to go against the narrative, they need to start getting their players, their depth players, to score in the manner that they were doing in not only the regular season, but also in the manner that they've shown they're capable of doing in the playoffs that they've done in the past 2 years. Because they've made 3 straight Stanley Cup finals, but they've lost the 2 before this one. So as of now, based on the formula, the Edmonton Oilers against the Florida Panthers are once again looking to be the favorites to make it to the Stanley Cup Finals. And now, Simon, tell us about the difference here between the offensive scoring and who, based on the formula, is our ultimate Stanley Cup pick.
Based on the formula, obviously you gotta go Edmonton. Again, it's so hard to, if this is the matchup that we are expecting, it is very rare in the NHL that a team loses twice back-to-back in the Stanley Cup final. Very rare. I don't know if it's happened too often, especially in the past 25 years. I don't know if it's happened really ever. Again, don't fact-check me on that. But that being said, I seriously do think that this is the Edmonton Oilers' year. I really do. I think Florida, as talented as they are and as persistent as they are, they only have one or two players who I think are really actually, that's not true. Yeah, I think they have 3 forwards who are really stepping up and playing above their pay grade, and that would be Sasha Barkov, Brad Marchand, who is looking like an incredibly valuable pickup, and Sam Bennett, who, again, from the GTHL boy. But I think a lot of their players that did step up in last year's playoffs, like Matthew Tkachuk, Sam Reinhart, Carter Verhaeghe, where has he been, right? I think that
they were shut down by Austin Matthews is where they were,
yeah,
and
you know what,
still the Leafs weren't able to win that series.
You know what, you know what, Jared, that is a very fair point. But again, you look at their roster, and then you look at Edmonton on the other hand, who has Connor McDavid. Obviously, how many times have we said Connor McDavid's name this show? But then also you have the guys like Connor Brown and Zach Hyman and Darnell Nurse, who are really stepping up and playing well above what they were capable of in the regular season.
Well above their means, frankly.
Well above their means, exactly. I think that this is Edmonton's series. If this plays out this way between Florida and Edmonton, I think it would be Edmonton's series to lose.
Because again, we will reference the fact that the Edmonton Oilers come into the series just comparing GTHL points and GTHL talent. It's a difference of 42 points for the Edmonton Oilers, only 16 for the Florida Panthers. The Edmonton Oilers, based on the formula that I personally am going against, I do believe, actually, I predicted a Dallas vs. Carolina final. So I'm going against this whole narrative.
Wow.
However, I'm in the minority there. For good reason, the 2 heavy favorites to walk away with the Stanley Cup, or rather to march their way into the Stanley Cup Finals, is for the second straight year, Florida Panthers against Edmonton Oilers. And then, based on the stats and the level of production they're getting from GTHL guys, it's likely that the Edmonton Oilers, the team that is getting over double the amount of points from GTHL players that the Florida Panthers are getting, they are seeming to be the favorite to walk away with the Stanley Cup.
I just want to make one very last point. I think if you're watching this and you're thinking, oh man, this does just seem like a big old coincidence. If the Edmonton Oilers do end up winning the Stanley Cup this year, and Connor Brown, Zach Hyman, and Connor McDavid, and all the other GTHL members, former members.
6 guys, remember. 6 guys on this team.
If all of those 6 guys end up playing above their means, as Jared put it, I think that you could take that as quite, maybe not undeniable, but pretty darn close to undeniable fact that the GTHL players do produce winning players in the NHL.
And as we've seen throughout the entirety of the Stanley Cup playoffs this year, based on the teams that moved on from the first round, based on the teams that moved out of the second round and onto the Final Four, the GTHL talent has come to play. The GTHL, it's the greatest development league in the world. I'd argue it, you'd argue it. I'd say a lot of people out there in hockey would argue it. And as such, it seems very likely that no matter which of these teams wins the Stanley Cup, their GTHL players and their GTHL contributors are likely to be a big reason for that result. With that being said, I've been Jared Rotenberg, joined alongside the amazing Simon Hendrikse, and this has been the first episode of YapTime.
Welcome to the Six Hockey.
Jared!